Stop. The word wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the quiet hum of the private dining room. And for a brief second, even the soft clink of crystal glasses seemed to hesitate as Jonathan Reed's pen hovered just above the final signature line of a $200 million agreement. His wrist still, his expression tightening not in anger, but in something far rarer for a man like him. Interruption. 10 minutes earlier, he had laughed, not cruelly, not overtly, but with the kind of effortless dismissal that came from decades of being right, of being the smartest man in every room he entered. And when he had looked at her, Emily Carter, the waitress with the simple uniform and quiet posture, he had already decided who she was, already assigned her a value that fit neatly into his world, something small, something forgettable. The room itself reflected everything he trusted. Mahogany walls, low amber lighting, a skyline view stretching across Manhattan like a promise of control, and around the table sat advisors, lawyers, men who nodded at the right moments and spoke only when necessary. Men who had spent weeks refining the numbers that now rested neatly on the pages in front of him. Everything was aligned, everything predictable, everything ready. And yet she stood there, just behind his shoulder, holding a silver coffee pot with steady hands. Her presence so quiet it had gone unnoticed until now. Jonathan didn't turn immediately, not fully, only enough to acknowledge that the voice had come from someone who should not have been part of this conversation, his eyes narrowing slightly as if adjusting to a detail that didn't belong. "Excuse me," he said, calm, measured, the same tone he used when correcting executives twice his age. Emily didn't flinch, didn't step back, and didn't rush to explain herself the way most people did when they realized they had crossed an invisible line. Instead, she glanced briefly at the document, then back at him, her expression composed, almost neutral, as if she were simply pointing out something obvious. "If you sign that," she said quietly, "you're accepting a liability structure that shifts after the second quarter." The words didn't land all at once, not for him, not for anyone at the table, because they weren't supposed to come from her, and that alone created a pause longer than any argument could have. One of the attorneys let out a small breath, almost a laugh, the kind meant to dissolve tension. But it faded quickly when Jonathan didn't join in. He set the pen down slowly, deliberately, and this time he turned fully, studying her not as a passing distraction, but as a problem to solve. Her uniform was immaculate but plain, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested practicality over style. Nothing about her appearance aligned with the precision of the statement she had just made, and yet her eyes didn't shift, didn't search for approval, didn't soften under scrutiny. "And how?" he asked, voice lower now, sharper. "Would you know that?" The question hung there, not aggressive, but heavy with expectation, the kind of question that usually forced people to retreat. But Emily simply set the coffee pot down on the table with a soft, controlled motion, the faint sound echoing more than it should have in the silence that followed. And for the first time since she had spoken, she allowed herself a small inhale, steady, unhurried. "Because," she said, just as quietly, "it's not written where you're looking." The room did not react all at once because understanding came slower than silence. And for a moment the only sound was the faint hum of the city beyond the glass as Jonathan Reed leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze no longer dismissive but precise, as if recalibrating the space between assumption and reality. While across the table one of the senior attorneys adjusted his glasses and flipped through the printed agreement with a subtle urgency that had not existed seconds before, fingers tracing lines that had already been reviewed a dozen times. And still Jonathan did not speak again immediately, because something in the way she had said it did not feel like a guess. It felt like certainty. Emily stood where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, her posture steady, her hands now resting lightly at her sides, as though she had already said everything that needed to. Slower this time, more measured, as if seeing her for the first time without the filter he had applied before. "To who?" he asked. Emily lifted her eyes just enough to meet his, and for the briefest moment, there was something there that was not challenge, not defiance, but clarity. "To you," she said, and then, just as calmly, she reached for the coffee pot again, as if the conversation had never belonged to her at all. No one reached for their glass, no one shifted in their seat, because the weight of that single sentence had already settled into the room. And Jonathan Reed did not look away this time. Not from her, not from the document, not from the realization forming quietly behind his composed expression, as the attorney cleared his throat and began scanning the clause again, slower now, tracing every word as if it had changed since the last time he read it. And perhaps it had, not in ink, but in consequence. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the edge of the table, his fingers interlaced in front of him, a posture he only used when something demanded full attention, not performance, not authority, just clarity. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the earlier amusement, only precision. "Explain the mechanism," he said. Emily did not hesitate, not because she was eager, but because she already understood the structure she had seen, and as she spoke, her tone remained steady, measured, as if she were walking through something inevitable rather than impressive. "The initial agreement caps your exposure through the first 2 quarters, she said, her eyes briefly lowering to the page again. "But the cross-reference clause removes that cap once the performance threshold is triggered, which it will be, based on your projected numbers, and when that happens, the liability does not stay shared. It consolidates." The attorney's pen stopped moving. "Entirely." Jonathan's gaze sharpened. "Consolidates where?" he asked. Emily answered without emphasis, without drama. "With the acquiring party." A pause followed, longer than before, because now the implication was no longer theoretical. It was specific, it had direction, and everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. One of the advisors shifted in his chair, finally breaking the stillness with a quiet exhale, while the attorney turned another page, searching, verifying, hoping perhaps for an interpretation that would soften the edge of what they were seeing. But it was not there. Jonathan leaned back again, slower this time, his eyes moving from the document to the men around the table, each of them avoiding his gaze in subtle ways, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Something had been missed, something important, and it had not been caught by the people he trusted to catch everything. His attention returned to Emily, and for the first time, there was no trace of dismissal left, only assessment, careful and deliberate. "How long did it take you to see that?" he asked. Emily adjusted her grip on the coffee pot slightly, the movement small, almost absent-minded, before she answered. "A few seconds," she said. No one spoke after that because there was nothing to say that would not make the silence heavier, and Jonathan's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind that came when variables shifted without warning. He reached for the document again, flipping back to the section she had indicated, reading it now with the same scrutiny he reserved for high-risk acquisitions, and this time, the structure revealed itself clearly, the way it should have from the beginning. "We restructure this," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, and then he looked up again, directly at her. Why say anything? The question was simple, but it carried more weight than before, because it was no longer about the contract. It was about her, about intention, about the choice to step into a space that was not hers. Emily met his gaze for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, her voice just as calm as before. "Because you were about to sign it," she said, and then, without waiting for acknowledgement, she turned slightly, stepping back into the quiet role she had occupied before, as if nothing had shifted at all, even though everything had. Jonathan did not pick up his pen again, not immediately, because something more valuable than the deal itself had shifted in front of him, something he could not sign away or delegate, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed the silence to remain, not as a tactic, but as a necessity, while the attorney quietly closed the folder halfway, no longer pretending that the agreement was ready, and one of the advisors leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if releasing a tension he had not realized he was carrying. Emily had already stepped back into place, her presence once again understated, almost invisible, the silver coffee pot resting lightly in her hand as she moved toward the far end of the table, offering a refill to someone who did not notice her at first. And that contrast, that quiet return to normalcy, made the moment feel even sharper, because it proved that nothing about her action had been for attention. Jonathan watched her for a second longer than necessary, then turned back to the document, flipping through the pages with controlled precision, not rushed, not careless, but thorough, as if retracing every step that had led him here. and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight, not louder, but more grounded. "We pause this," he said, and the decision did not sound like hesitation. It sounded final. The attorney nodded quickly, almost relieved, while another advisor began gathering his notes. The quiet choreography of a meeting dissolving before its intended conclusion. Still, Jonathan remained seated, his focus no longer on the contract, but on something less tangible, something harder to measure. He looked up again, finding Emily across the room as she set down a glass with the same steady motion she had used before, and then he said, "Emily." It was the first time he had used her name, and it landed differently than everything else he had said that afternoon. She turned, not startled, not hesitant, simply attentive, and walked back toward the table with the same calm rhythm, stopping at a respectful distance. "Yes, sir," she replied. Jonathan held her gaze for a moment, not searching for weakness, not testing, but evaluating something he had not expected to find. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" he asked. The question was direct, but not aggressive, and it carried a curiosity that had replaced the earlier dismissal. Emily did not answer right away, not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose her words carefully, and when she spoke, her voice remained quiet, unchanged. "I used to study financial law," she said. There was no elaboration, no explanation, just a simple statement that did not try to justify itself. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in recalculation, as if a new set of variables had just entered the equation. "Used to," he repeated. Emily gave a small nod, her expression steady. "Yes, sir." The room, though quieter now, still held a few lingering listeners, men who had not fully left, their attention drawn back despite themselves, and Jonathan noticed, but did not dismiss them, because this moment, whatever it was, mattered more than appearances. "And now you serve tables," he said, not as an insult this time, but as an observation that did not yet make sense to him. Emily met his gaze without hesitation, and for the briefest moment, there was something behind her eyes, not regret, not pride, but something deeper, something resolved. "For now," she said. Jonathan leaned back again, slower this time, his expression unreadable, as if he were looking at a version of the world that did not follow the rules he had always trusted, and in that quiet space between them, the balance had shifted in a way that no contract ever could, because it was no longer about what was written on paper, but about what had been revealed without it. Jonathan did not respond immediately to her answer, because "for now" was not a phrase he encountered often in his world, not from people who understood value, and certainly not from someone who had just prevented a mistake that could have cost him more than most people would earn in a lifetime. And as the last of his advisors quietly gathered their things and stepped out of the room, their polished shoes fading into the distant hallway, the space shifted again, becoming quieter, more private, until it was just the two of them and the faint reflection of the city lights stretching across the glass. He stood then, slowly, buttoning his jacket out of habit rather than necessity, his mind no longer occupied by the contract, but by the anomaly standing a few feet away, and when he spoke, his tone was different again, not softer, but more intentional, as if each word carried weight now. "You saw what an entire legal team missed," he said, not as praise, but as a statement of fact. Emily did not react to the observation, did not correct it or accept it. She simply held his gaze for a brief moment before lowering it slightly, a gesture not of submission, but of restraint, as if she had no interest in turning the moment into something larger than it needed to be. "They were looking at the structure," she replied quietly, "not the timing." Jonathan studied her, the way she separated those ideas, the way she reduced complexity into something almost simple. And for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, not uncertainty, but curiosity without control. "And you?" he asked. Emily adjusted the edge of the tablecloth slightly, smoothing a corner that did not need smoothing, a small movement that gave her a second before answering. "I look at what changes," she said. The words lingered, because they applied to more than just the contract, and Jonathan understood that, even if he did not fully know why. He took a step closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough to shift the dynamic from observation to engagement. "You are not where you belong," he said. It was not a question, and it was not meant to be dismissive, but it carried the weight of a conclusion he had reached quickly, the same way he evaluated companies, markets, people. Emily lifted her eyes again, meeting his without hesitation, and there was no defensiveness in her expression, only clarity. "People rarely are," she said. The answer was simple, but it unsettled something in him, not because it challenged his authority, but because it removed the idea that position defined capability. Jonathan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, as if resetting his own thinking, and then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a card, placing it on the table between them with deliberate care. "Come to my office tomorrow," he said. The offer was direct, expected even, the kind of opportunity that most people would grasp before it fully landed. But Emily did not move, did not reach for the card, did not let her expression change. Instead, she glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her voice just as steady as before. "I work a double shift tomorrow," she said. There was no apology in the statement, no hesitation, just a fact. Jonathan looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she stood, at the way she held herself without needing the room to acknowledge her, and something in that moment shifted again, not in power, but in understanding. He nodded once, slowly, and instead of insisting, instead of adjusting the offer to fit his expectation, he did something he rarely did. He waited. The card remained on the table, untouched, a quiet possibility. And Emily reached for the coffee pot once more, refilling his cup with the same calm precision as before, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Jonathan did not reach for the coffee immediately, even after she filled the cup, because his attention remained fixed on something far less tangible than the deal he had just walked away from. And for a brief moment, the room held a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar, not tense, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if both of them understood that the conversation had shifted into something neither of them had planned. He glanced once more at the card resting on the table, then back at her, measuring not her response, but her absence of one, and that absence told him more than any acceptance would have. "Most people would have taken that," he said, his tone even, not accusatory, just observant. Emily set the coffee pot down gently on the side station, aligning it with the edge in a small, precise movement before answering, her voice unchanged, steady as before. "Most people were not standing here 10 minutes ago," she replied. The answer lingered, not because it was defensive, but because it reframed the moment entirely, and Jonathan allowed himself a slight pause, absorbing the implication that she was not reacting to the offer. She was responding to the context that had created it. He gave a small nod, almost to himself, then stepped away from the table, moving toward the window where the city stretched endlessly beneath them, lights flickering like a network of decisions being made in real time. And for someone who had built his life on control, on predicting outcomes, there was something unexpectedly grounding about a moment he could not fully map. "You do not seem surprised," he said, still facing the glass. Emily followed his movement with her eyes, but did not step closer, maintaining the same respectful distance that had defined her presence all evening. "About what?" she asked quietly. Jonathan turned slightly, enough to look at her again. "About being right," he said. Emily considered the question for a brief second, not searching for the correct answer, but the honest one, and when she spoke, there was no trace of pride in her voice. "I am used to noticing things people overlook," she said. Jonathan studied her, the simplicity of the statement, the lack of emphasis, and he realized that what unsettled him was not her intelligence, but her relationship to it, the way she did not use it to elevate herself, did not display it, did not need recognition for it. "And you are comfortable letting it go unnoticed?" he asked. Emily's gaze shifted briefly toward the table, toward the untouched card, and then back to him. "Not everything needs to be seen to matter," she said. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but firm, and for a moment, Jonathan did not respond, because he understood that this was not a conversation he could steer in the way he usually did, not with authority, not with persuasion, but only with attention. He walked back toward the table, stopping beside the chair he had occupied earlier, his hand resting lightly on its back, and then, after a brief pause, he did something that felt almost out of place for him. He slid the card a few inches closer to her side of the table, not pushing it, not insisting, just placing it within reach. Then consider it an option, he said. Emily looked at the card, not immediately, but after a second, as if acknowledging it on her own terms. And this time, she did not ignore it completely. She simply let her fingers rest lightly on its edge for a moment before withdrawing her hand. Options change, she said softly. Jonathan held her gaze, a faint shift in his expression, not disagreement, not approval, but recognition. So do outcomes, he replied. The room fell quiet again, not with uncertainty, but with something more measured, more balanced, as if the lines that had once separated them had softened into something less defined. And without another word, Emily picked up the coffee pot once more, moving past him with the same calm precision, leaving behind a silence that no longer belonged to him alone. The door closed softly behind the last of the executives, and with it, the room seemed to exhale, shedding the last traces of urgency that had filled it minutes before, leaving only the quiet glow of the city and the faint reflection of two figures who no longer fit the roles they had walked in with. Jonathan remained by the table, not seated, not moving, his hand still resting lightly on the back of the chair, as if anchoring himself to something familiar, while everything else had shifted. And across the room, Emily continued her work, her movements measured, unhurried, as she cleared a glass, straightened a napkin, adjusted a detail no one else would have noticed, returning the space to order with the same quiet precision she had used to dismantle a $200 million mistake. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary, not with curiosity alone now, but with a kind of respect that did not need to be stated, because it had already changed the way he stood, the way he listened, the way he chose his next words. You knew they would not catch it, he said, breaking the silence without raising his voice. Emily paused briefly, her hand resting on the edge of the tablecloth before she looked up, not surprised by the question, only acknowledging it. I knew they were not looking for it, she replied. The distinction was subtle, but Jonathan caught it immediately, because it was the same difference that separated good decisions from great ones, the difference between following a process and understanding it. He nodded once, slowly, then stepped away from the chair, closing the space between them again, not as a man asserting control, but as someone trying to understand what could not be reduced to a simple explanation. And what are you looking for? He asked. Emily considered the question for a brief second, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights stretched endlessly, patterns within patterns, movement within stillness, before she answered. What changes when no one is paying attention? She said. Jonathan let the words settle, because they echoed something deeper than the contract, something that extended beyond numbers and clauses into the way people revealed themselves when they believed they were not being observed. He exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, and for the first time that evening, there was no calculation behind it, only recognition. That is a dangerous skill, he said. Emily's expression softened just slightly, not into a smile, but into something quieter, something knowing. Only for the people who rely on being unseen, she replied. The room fell still again, but this time, the silence carried a different weight, not tension, not uncertainty, but alignment, as if both of them had reached the same conclusion from opposite directions. Jonathan glanced once more at the card on the table, then back at her, and without breaking the rhythm of the moment, he said, "Keep it." It was not an instruction, not an expectation, just a statement, and Emily looked at the card again, her fingers brushing its edge briefly before she picked it up, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with quiet acknowledgement. She did not examine it, did not turn it over. She simply held it for a second, then slipped it into the pocket of her apron, as if placing it exactly where it belonged for now. Jonathan watched the movement, not because it confirmed anything, but because it completed something that had begun the moment she said stop, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to clarify. Then Emily turned, continuing her work with the same calm presence, while Jonathan stood in the center of the room, no longer the man who had walked in expecting control, but someone who had just learned that the most important details were often the ones no one thought to question. And in that quiet realization, the balance between them did not need to be spoken, because it had already changed everything. Jonathan did not leave right away, even after the room had returned to its quiet, ordered state, because something about the moment resisted closure, as if walking out too soon would reduce it to something simpler than it was, and he was not willing to do that, not this time. Instead, he moved slowly toward the window again, his reflection faint against the glass, the city stretching endlessly below, alive with motion and decisions that mirrored the one he had just avoided, and behind him. Emily continued her work without pause, her presence blending seamlessly back into the rhythm of the restaurant, unnoticed by most, unchanged in appearance, yet entirely different in meaning. A few new guests entered the space, their voices low, their attention fixed on menus and conversations that felt small compared to what had just unfolded, and Emily greeted them with the same calm professionalism, her tone warm but measured, as if the past 20 minutes had not altered anything at all. Jonathan watched this quietly, the contrast settling deeper than he expected, because in his world, moments like that demanded recognition, escalation, something visible. But here, it dissolved into routine, into something almost invisible. He turned back toward the table where the contract still lay partially open, the ink untouched, the decision suspended, and for a second, he considered what would have happened if she had said nothing, how easily the room would have moved forward, how confidently he would have signed, how irreversible the consequence would have been, and that thought did not sit comfortably. He walked back to the table, closing the folder himself this time, not delegating, not signaling, just completing the action quietly, and then he picked it up, holding it for a moment before setting it aside, as if physically removing the mistake from the space. When he looked up again, Emily was already moving past him, carrying a tray with practiced balance, her focus on the next task, the next detail, the next moment that required attention, and he realized that whatever she had done earlier was not an exception for her. It was simply how she moved through the world. "Emily," he said again, not louder, but enough to reach her through the soft ambient noise. She turned, stepping toward him with the same composed expression, her pace unhurried. "Yes, sir," she replied. Jonathan studied her for a brief second, then shook his head slightly, not in dismissal, but in quiet acknowledgement of something he had not fully understood before. "Nothing," he said. The word was simple, but it carried something different this time, not emptiness, but acceptance, as if he had realized that not every answer needed to be spoken, not every realization needed to be explained. Emily held his gaze for a moment, reading the shift without asking for clarification, and then gave a small nod before turning back to her work, the conversation ending without a formal close. Jonathan remained where he was for a few seconds longer, then reached for his jacket, adjusting it with the same precision he always had, but the movement felt different now, less about presentation, more about grounding himself before stepping back into a world that suddenly seemed less certain than it had an hour ago. He walked toward the exit, his pace steady, his posture unchanged, but his attention no longer fixed on control or outcome, instead lingering on something quieter, something he could not quite define. And as he reached the door, he paused just briefly, not turning back, not searching for confirmation, just allowing the moment to settle one last time before stepping out into the city, leaving behind a room that had returned to normal and a truth that would not. The city air was cooler outside, carrying the faint echo of traffic and distant conversations, but Jonathan Reed did not register any of it the way he normally would, because his mind was still inside that room, replaying not the numbers, not the contract, but the moment. A quiet voice had shifted the outcome of everything. And for a man who had built his reputation on anticipating risk, on controlling variables before they formed, the realization settled slowly that the one thing he had not accounted for was not complexity, but simplicity, not hidden data, but an overlooked perspective. He walked down the block with measured steps, his pace steady, his expression composed. Yet beneath it, something had recalibrated, something subtle but permanent, and when he reached the waiting car, he paused before opening the door, his reflection faint in the tinted glass, as if giving himself one last second to acknowledge the shift before returning to the world that expected him to remain unchanged. Inside, the silence of the car felt different, not empty, but reflective, and instead of reaching for his phone, Instead of moving on to the next deal, the next decision, he allowed the moment to stay, unprocessed, unfinished, because for once, the outcome was not something to move past, but something to carry forward. Back inside the restaurant, the rhythm had fully returned, plates moved, glasses clinked softly, conversations overlapped in low tones, and Emily Carter moved through it all with the same quiet precision, her presence blending into the environment as if nothing significant had happened. And perhaps that was the most remarkable part, not the intelligence she had shown, but the fact that she did not need it to be seen, did not reshape herself around it, did not let it define the way she stood or spoke. As the evening stretched on, she cleared the last of the private room, her movements efficient, her attention steady, and when she reached the table where the contract had once been, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not in reflection, but in completion, as if closing a moment that did not require revisiting. Her hand moved to her apron pocket briefly, the edge of a card pressing lightly against her fingers, a small, quiet reminder of something unresolved, something not yet decided, and she did not take it out, did not look at it. She simply left it there, exactly where it belonged for now. Hours later, when the final guests had left and the lights dimmed slightly, Emily stepped outside into the same city Jonathan had entered earlier, the air cool against her skin, the noise softer at this hour, and for a moment, she stood still, not thinking about the contract, not thinking about the offer, but simply present, grounded in a reality that did not depend on recognition or validation. Somewhere across the city, Jonathan sat in his office, the lights still on, the contract reopened on his desk, not as a deal to close, but as a lesson to understand, and for the first time in a long time, he read it not to confirm his own judgment, but to question it, to see what he had missed, and more importantly, why. The distance between them remained, measured in blocks, in buildings, in lives that did not intersect easily, and yet something connected them now, not an agreement, not a promise, but a shift in awareness that neither of them needed to define. And in the quiet space between what had happened and what might come next, one truth remained, steady and unchanged, that the most powerful moments do not announce themselves, they arrive quietly, unnoticed, until everything else begins to move around them.